Well, hello and welcome to another study session of Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, a Catholic Response. I'm Dr. Thibault. We're looking at Chapter 6 today, which is Understanding the Blanchard's Typology. Here's a picture on the screen of Dr. Blanchard, who's still alive and still not really publishing books or many articles anymore, but you can find his Twitter, and he's still pretty active on the issues of sexuality and transgenderism today. So we'll hop right into it. Some sections in the past we've had each section had its own video. This we're doing in all of Chapter 6 in one video. I think it's simple enough concepts that they can be put together in just one video. The philosophical stuff, sometimes they're so heavy that it's easier to break them up. So when we talk about Blanchard's typology, well, first, who is Dr. Blanchard? Well, he has a PhD in psychology from the University of Illinois. And he worked with sex offenders and studied paraphilias. He ended up working for the Clark Institute of Psychiatry in Toronto, where he really became well known. He worked for the Center of Addiction and Mental Health, but he had access to the files for the Clark Institute, and he did an extensive amount of reading and research, some of his own research and some reading the files of the patients to come up with ideas about the transgender issue. So today he's often not well liked by transgender activists or gender ideologists, but I think there's enough truth in the things that he said, and he's so well known that you can't really have a book on transgender and not at least talk about Dr. Blanchard. And I tend to think that he's really onto something, and well, you can judge for yourself. So Dr. Blanchard was also part of the committees for the DSM-4 and the DSM-5. So I think that makes him fairly reputable, since people on both sides of the argument end up citing the DSM. So since he helped write the DSM, it makes sense. Dr. Blanchard he just kind of, one thing is you have to think back that he's writing in the 1980s. We are not under the politically correct era that we are in today, and the transgender issue was far more marginal than it is today. So, when we hear the language Dr. Blanchard uses when talking about the transgender issue, you have to remember this is 1980. So so it's important not to take offense when no offense was intended. Many things he said were very progressive at the time. Now, many people in the activist community would see this as retrograde, right? Regressive. But he... I don't think you can put him in today's context. I think if he were to write this stuff today, he would write it in a different style, but it doesn't change the subject matter, right? The subject matter doesn't change. Dr. Blanchard has gone on record and said, that he doesn't go out of his way to be politically incorrect or to offend anyone. That's not part of his ideology. He's not saying things just to upset people, but he does think that as a social scientist, he has to tell the truth, which is a novel concept. So you have to just, whatever the agenda is not as important as what the truth is. So that we should stick with the truth. So I think that's kind of what my book intended to do, was stick with the truth and not get involved in ideology in either direction. So the first group, there's two major groups and there's two subgroups. But the first major group, again, this is coming from Dr. Blanchard reading through the case files of many, what they call at the time, transsexual people. People have come in with gender identity issues. And he was able to say, well, out of all of these people, they seem to fit into primarily two primary categories. The first one is autogynephilic. and it's translated from to love oneself as a woman, auto, self, gyna, female, and philic, to love oneself, to love, right? So to love oneself as a female. Sometimes people would refer to it as gynephilic because the auto part is the more offensive part of it for some people. So to love oneself as a female. So if a man believes he's a woman and we say, well, you love yourself as a female, the response would be, well, I am a female, right? I am a female. Well, so if you don't want to offend people and still use the term, then gynephilic is just the love of womanhood, right? The love of women. So it's less offensive, right? Maybe if it takes the pressure off, then use it, right? Yeah, but it's when anybody's using gynephilic, what they're really talking about is Blanchard's typology, Autogynephilia, right? Whatever the name might be, the concept's the same. So the people who are autogynephilic, he found, were people who were typically biological male who felt like they were women and were attracted to women. So you have somebody who is a natal male or assigned male at birth who feels like a woman and is attracted to women. Now, people who have this characteristic, they're typically live as very stereotypical, passing, heterosexual men for most of their lives. You know, they grow up and in high school they're just one of the guys. They play sports, they date girls, they do all the guy stuff. There's no signs whatsoever of femininity in any way, you know, and people like this often they can go into the military, they can be involved in sports and athletics and things like that. They often date typical of heterosexual men. They often marry women. They often have children. And when there is a transition, the average age at the Clark Clinic, where Dr. Blanchard was at, was 39 years old. So people present for the first time to the gender clinic at 39 years old, so fairly late in life, right? You're nearly 40 and when you're saying, I think I'm a woman, right? So fairly late. Now this is one group, and people who know transgender people, you might know people from this group. I hear these stories a lot. Working with transgender issues, everybody I know has met somebody who is transgender, and they often say, I have a buddy of mine, you know, people tell you their stories. And they're often, somebody 60 years old, military guy, tough, rough, and he comes out, he's a woman, right? No signs previously that the person is at all woman or female or feminine or anything like that. 60 years old military guy comes out as transgender. Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner is another, I think, fairly typical expression of this. Right, when you, this isn't meant to be an insult, but when you see Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner, despite, I imagine, quite a bit of reconstructive surgery, right? Money is no object. He still kind of walks and presents and holds himself a bit as a man, right? There's still a certain amount of masculinity there, despite all of the cosmetic surgeries. Now, that doesn't say anything about the person's state of mind, right? That doesn't say anything about how they identify or what they state. But from the outside looking in, it looks fairly typically masculine, right? This is typical. Sometimes the gender critical feminists, when they talk about a guy in a dress or a trucker in a dress, right? The trucker in a dress is the typical autogynephilic, right? It's somebody who's otherwise appears to be a heterosexual man, right, in a dress. And they kind of, if you were to take any, older kind of masculine heterosexual man and you put him in a dress, they would act and look and behave exactly like a transgender person who is autogynephilic. Again, that shouldn't be offensive to transgender people because the gender ideology has made it very clear that gender expression and gender identity are not the same. Therefore, this shouldn't be offensive to say, well, gender expression is a man and gender identity might be whatever they feel like they are. So this is kind of an interesting group, right? And Dr. Blanchard, has pointed out that it's kind of rooted. He suspects it's rooted in a type of transvestitism, right? Transvestite would be typically a man who dresses like a woman for a sexual fetish of some kind, right? A transvestite does not believe that they are a woman, but that they dress as a woman for sexual desires, right? And then they take it off and they go back to being a man. He's found with these studies that 80% of autogynephilic individuals have some type of sexual arousal when they first start cross-dressing. Well, that's a sign that it may be linked to transvestitism. A lot of people who do this, there was a transvestite period first, and it appears like it's transvestitism which has become more permanent, right, or more predominant. It has overtaken their life. If there is any type of times when they go to sexually, if they go to men, right, not once they're now presenting as a woman, if they go sexually to men, typically it's to fulfill some type of feminine fantasy of being treated as a woman, but usually it doesn't last, or they stay away from it because they are typically heterosexual men, meaning that they're interested in women. They're not interested in men, right? So although if they were sexually intimate with men, it would fulfill that feminine fantasy. It also isn't their sexual orientation, so it doesn't really work that well. So they end up, usually after some experimentation, end up settling back for being with women, which would then at that point make them lesbians, right? Because they're women attracted to women at that point, which is sometimes a disappointment, right? Because it's like, you did all this to become a woman and now you're a lesbian. You're still not a real woman, right? In the real feminine sense. Dr. Blanchard suspects that people who are autogynephilic are people who they are so in love with the feminine. They are so in love with women that they internalize it. So it's misdirected attention, right? So a heterosexual man has their sexual gaze on women. Autogynephilics are so in love with women that they have turned themselves into women, right? I guess this could make a little bit of sense, right? So like if you love this, if you're a heterosexual man, you probably like the smell of perfume that women wear. You probably like the feeling of the fabric of your wife's dress, right? The feeling of female clothing, the softness of female hair, female breasts, right? You like these things. You like the female thing. You're drawn to it. That's one of the things that makes you a heterosexual male, is to be drawn to these things. Now, if you internalize that, right? If you have now, instead of seeing that in the other, right? Instead of this focus being other, you have now turned yourself into the woman. Well, now you have breasts all the time, right? Now you have the soft clothing all the time. You have the perfume all the time. You have the soft, long hair all the time. You have misdirected your affection. The affection is intended to be complementary, right? The yin and the yang. It's supposed to be. You're supposed to have that opposite draw to that, and it's not supposed to be you, right? In some sense, there's a narcissism in turning the object of your affection in on itself, right? There's a certain narcissism there, where there should be a certain otherness to our attraction. So, this is just one group. So go ahead into the next one. The bisexual type, transsexual, transgender person. They're very similar to the autogynephilic that we just covered. They're basically the autogynephilic, typical male behavior, typical signs of masculinity growing up. Join the military, get married, have children. Typical male things. Come out around 40 years old as being transgender. Very typical of the autogynephilic, but they attempt to have the sexual orientation of, well, if they became a woman, they intend for it to be a heterosexual woman, right, which would make them a homosexual man, right? So there's an attempt to fully embody the feminine. I mentioned this in the autogynephilic, but they really are more committed to really being a heterosexual woman in every possible way, which then would mean that they are sexually intimate with men. But usually their real deep down, the bottom of their heart affections is for women. So this kind of bisexual, but I think, well, Dr. Blanchard points out, it's more of an aid, right? I know masculinity and femininity don't have everything to do with sexual orientation, but people who are autogynephilics are usually men's men, right? Man's man. The chances that they're bisexual is truly, if they were to remain a man, they would not be bisexual. They would be a heterosexual man. So once they become this, it creates the tension within them. But this is really kind of an extension of autogynephilia. The next one is this type of asexual, transsexual. Now this can be misunderstood. Dr. Blanchard points out asexual doesn't mean in this sense that you are not interested sexually in anyone. It doesn't mean you're asexual in what we typically mean by it, but that you're not, what he means by it is that you are not sexually interested in other people, male or female. You are only really sexually attracted to yourself, right? And it's usually just sexually attracted to yourself as a woman, right? So if it's a male who turns female, that they are sexually attracted to themselves as a woman, so there's maybe a lot of masturbation and a lot of sexual arousal, but it's alone. It's with themselves. It's kind of a classic narcissism, as you can see. Dr. Blanchard said, about 7 to 8% of transgender people tend to be this kind of asexual type. Otherwise, it's typical of autogynephilia. So like I said at the beginning, there's really two, and then there's subparts, but bisexual and asexual are really extensions of autogynephilia. And autogynephilia is pretty much always male to female, right? Male to female. It's just like with transsexual. There's really no such thing as transsexualism for female to male, right? There's no cases where women putting on men's clothing is sexually arousing. In our culture, basically all women wear men's clothes anyway. So, there's not really a sexual arousal element. It's not like women put on men's clothes in the bedroom for sexual arousal. Not really. That doesn't. Just like female transsexualism doesn't exist. Autogynephilia being an extension of transsexualism as its cause, it doesn't really exist in females. The next one is androphilic, and that means man lover. Andro meaning male, lover, and it's otherwise can be called homosexual type. Transsexual. Now this one applies evenly to men and women. So there can be men who are androphilic, and there can be women who can be androphilic. That's a contradictory of terms, but at first, when Dr. Blanchard was studying this, almost all those test subjects were always male, right? It's kind of always male type of thing back in the 80s. So, if he's looking at the case studies in the 80s, he's talking about cases that were rising in the 70s or earlier. So now we know, that there's about even distribution of androphilic, which makes it not such a great term, which is why sometimes it'd be better to use just the term homosexual type. The problem you then get with calling it homosexual type is you're talking about, let's say, a natal male who feels as if they're a female and is attracted to men. So if the person was a male and continued to be a male, they would be homosexual. Gender theorists would oppose to this idea of homosexual type transgender person because they say, well, they're not a man, right? They might have been assigned male at birth, but they are, right? They're ontologically female, therefore they are actually heterosexual, right? That would be the stance. But using Blanchard's terms, he calls it homosexual type or androphilic. Now, these people are notably different than the autogynephilics. So typically, let's say we say a male again. So typically a male who is androphilic would grow up very feminine, right? He's playing with the dolls, he's cooking, playing with the baking oven, he has he mothers his stuffed animals. He wears his mother's clothing. He has all of the typical, sissy characteristics, right? The term we use. It's kind of a rude term, but that's, gets the point across, right? The typical sissy type behavior. You would think a parent who sees a child like this, a male like this, would say the child is probably gay, right? That would be the thought of a boy who's doing all these things. So when a transgender person who's androphilic comes out, usually you see it coming, right? Gynephilic, this came out of nowhere. If you were married or you've been married to this man your whole life, and all of a sudden he says, "I'm a woman," you didn't see that coming, right? You wouldn't see it coming with autogynephilia. But with androphilic, you see it coming, right? Same thing with if the person was assigned female at birth, a natal female, we would call them a tomboy, right? More socially acceptable than being a sissy, right? Tomboy. And people grow out of it, right? Feminine males grow up, and they're either, most of the time, either homosexual or they grow out of it entirely and they're heterosexual, right? They might just be feminine males, right? That happens. Most feminine males do not turn out to be women. And tomboys even more so, right? Even more so tomboys. Just because a girl likes sports and climbing trees, it doesn't mean that she's a boy, and it doesn't mean that she's a lesbian. People grow out of these things. But anyone who's androphilic, when they were young, there were signs, right? There were signs. You're aware of the dysphoria earlier on, right? These are the people who would say, back when I was 14, I knew, right? Back when I was 8, I knew, right? Right? These are the types of things an androphilic would say, and autogynephilic would not really be aware of that at that age, mostly because it's so sexually driven, right? Intercourse driven, right? Autogynephilia. This is not having anything to do with having sex, right? It's nothing to do with intercourse, androphilic. It's about really much more about expression, right? And attraction. But it's not sex in the same way autogynephilia is more about sex. The average age of a person presenting at the gender clinic, the Clark Clinic, was 24 years of age. Remember, the autogynephilic was closer to 40. 39 was the average. So much younger, right? Which makes sense, because if you were a young boy and your entire life you presented very feminine, well, by 24, when your friends are starting to date and marry and things like this, you're saying, well, I'm not like this, right? It's very clearly, I can't fit into that mold, right? I can't fit into that mold. unlike autogynephilia, where they fit perfectly well into the military, into masculine things, because they're very heterosexual in a sense, right? So this is lastly, we might think of this in terms of, like in Thailand, they have the lady boys, right? These boys that very convincingly express themselves as female. And remember, 80% of autogynephilics, for the first time they start cross-dressing their sexual arousal. With androphilic individuals, only 10% feel any type of sexual arousal when they start cross-dressing. So what's the point of making these distinctions? A lot of criticisms for these distinctions, but what's the point? Well, in essence, the point is, if there are largely two groups of transgender types of people, then if a person says, well, I'm transgender, we aren't talking about the same thing, right? The difference between an autogynephilic and an androphilic is night and day. Right? We're not talking anything. They're like two entirely different disorders or manifestations, right? And another reason why this is important is what I think the reason Dr. Blanchard points it out is they have different, what we say, etiologies or origins, right? The origin of these feelings are different. So one is based out of some type of sexual arousal, transvestitism, right? Which might be different than transvestitism, right? But there's a common link with transvestitism. And the other one is an extreme form of homosexuality in a sense, right? It's the boy is so homosexual that he's practically a woman, right? the girl is so homosexual he's practically a male, right? This is not politically correct terms, right? This is not. You will not get this in a woke corporate lecture. But this is Dr. Blanchard's theory, right? And again, writing in 1980, and there seems to be a lot of truth here, right? Because, whenever you hear of somebody who's not under 20, people who are older in life who are transgender, people who've been transgender for years now, when you ask about their story, they tell you about the story, and they seem to fall into two categories. One is this, well, I was married, I had children, I was a gym teacher, I was a cop, I was a military person, and they look like a woman, they look like a bus driver in a dress, right? That's kind of the appearance. And you're kind and you're compassionate and you're respectful, but the gender expression is a bus driver in a dress, right? Truck driver in a dress. And then you meet other people, and these are usually the people who you wouldn't know that they're transgender, right? If it's a person was born a male, they look like a woman, right? Or if they're a woman, they look like a boy, right? They're completely convincing in their expression, because in some ways they've actually had practice of presenting in the opposite gender expression their entire lives, right? In some sense, the young boy has taken on the role of a girl his entire life, so it's fairly natural for him to present in a feminine way. When he was in a male presenting way, it was kind of unusual, right? You would meet that guy and you'd go like, oh my lord, that's a pretty feminine male, right? So in some ways it comes off natural, and you can't tell that the person, you might not be able to tell that the person is transgender, right? So there's a very big difference between these two groups of people, and people tend to fit into those. Where people don't fit into them, and this isn't really covered that much in this section, but where this doesn't work is with the new generation of people coming out as trans with like a trans ideology, right? So, somebody's coming out at 23 years old as trans, but they have a history of depression and autism and other issues going on, and they're part of a gender ideology, right? They might not even be trans. So it kind of throws the metric. So anybody who's come out in the last 10 years, and they're particularly young people, they might not fit into these categories perfectly, but it might also mean that it might not really be part of really who they are, right? Some of these people could be homosexual, but not trans, right? So if you were a very feminine male and you were homosexual and you got involved with all this ideology, you might say, well, I'm not gay. I'm really a woman, or I'm non-binary, or one of these things. But that maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Time will tell. But I think these two categories are useful. Now, there are critics of Blanchard's theory. He's not well liked by the ideology people, and the people who would like him, well, people aren't reading it. They just don't like him, right? So people like Julia Serrano came out with the arguments to debunk it. Modern day gender theorists, transgender gender theorists like Rachel Ann Williams, who I've talked to, she says, Julia Serrano, she has thoroughly debunked Blanchard. Blanchard's dead. Blanchard's, his theory is useless. We have debunked it, right? There's no value in it any longer. Well, to kind of summarize her three main points, her critique of Blanchard, is one idea is that the typology is based on clinical samples of case study and not scientific research with controls. That's her statement. Usually whenever you don't like somebody's research, that's what you say, right? Dr. Lippmann's, that's what people say about Dr. Lippmann. You say, well, it's not a good study, but I think it's fair enough to say, if you look at the case files of hundreds of people and you see trends within the case files of hundreds of people, that is a perfectly fair approach to creating typologies, right? Based on observation, right? In some ways, it's very Aristotelian that you sit back and you watch how people actually are in real life, right? Look at the files, right? You're not looking for anything, right? You're listening to them tell their story, and when you hear enough stories, you can start to make distinctions, right? Typological distinctions, if any exist. And that's what he did. It's very observational, right? I think that's perfectly fine, right? The next one is they don't like that it's been turning transgenderism into fetishism or sexual orientation, right? If you're saying, well, one's an extension of transvestitism, well, that offends people. Now, I am not a transvestite. I am a transgender, right? Because I am a woman, right? This is a very strongly felt thing, right? Very important to them that they be perceived as a woman, right? That's part of that identity. So if you were to say, well, you really just get sexually attracted and sexually aroused when you present yourself as a woman, well, you could see people get very offended by that. The other one is that, androphilic, that this is a type of extension of sexual orientation. Again, they get very upset at that. The problem with this being so upset is, if you could objectively look at it and say, yes, there seems to be based on some type of sexual arousal and sexual orientation. Well, if that's the case, then medical insurance is not going to cover it. Right? This is one of Julia Serrano's complaints is, well, if this is true, then it's not a disorder, people aren't in the wrong bodies, and why would insurance continue to pay for it? I don't know. Why would they? I don't know, but making an argument that because insurance won't pay for it if this is true, therefore it cannot be true, I think is a very weak argument. It's either true or not true, regardless of whether insurance will pay for it or not. And lastly, it challenges the ontological argument that a transgender woman is a woman, right? If this is really through the lens of gender dysphoria, then you're saying what you are, you desire to be a woman, you desire to be a man. You would be more comfortable as a man, you'd be more comfortable as a woman, there's an interest in this, you would like to try it. This is different than saying you are a man or you are a woman, right? Dr. Blanchard's approach, you would be saying, well, you are a feminine man, or you are a masculine woman, or you are a man who is sexually aroused and enjoys wearing women's, being perceived as a woman. Well, this is fine, but it has nothing to do with your ontology of being a man or being a woman, right? So that can offend you, right? It can offend you, but the question is really, is it true, not is it offensive, right? And Julius Serrano's point is really, well, this offends people. Well, the fact that it offends people is completely irrelevant, right? Right. Pastorally, you don't want to offend people, but if the science offends you, well, it's not the job of science to be sensitive. It's the job of science to tell us what is true, right? Knowledge, right? Knowledge of the natural sciences, right? This is important. It's not ideology, it's science, right? Another critic was Charles Moser, MD, says, although autogynephilia exists, the theory is flawed. Many males to females readily admit that this construct describes their sexual interest and motivation. Nevertheless, it is not clear how accurately Blanchard's theory predicts the behavior, history, and motivation of male to females in general. So what Dr. Moser is saying is, many transgender people, Blanchard has hit the nail right on the head, right? This describes their sexual interest and motivations, right? For many, many people. But we don't know if it predicts it for everyone. Well, is that an argument, right? If you're saying this real group of people who are transgender say, yep, that's accurate, well, that's pretty good. And now you're saying there's also a hypothetical group of people who we can't name, who we don't know if they exist, but they may exist, and it may not relate to these hypothetical people. Well, I don't think that's a very good argument, right? If you think that's true, find a real group of transgender people and have them say, this does not describe me, right? This does not describe my experience, my motivations, my history, my behavior, right? That's fine. 200 people say it is. 500 people say it isn't. Okay, well, now you've debunked the theory. But you can't say 200 people say it is, and there may be people who say it isn't. Well, people may not think that it is. Well, who, right? Talk about unscientific. Now, people have come to the defense then of Dr. Blanchard in response, usually from the University of Toronto. His colleagues, they have quite a group up there. So people like Dr. Michael Bailey, they came out with a book, The Man Who Became Queen, The Science of Gender Bending and Transsexualism. When he came out with his book, enforcing the Blanchard typology, he had a lot of critics against him because he spent a lot of time hanging out in places where transgender or transsexual people were to get firsthand experience, and there's always getting titillated by this, and he's a predator preying on transgender people. There's all these accusations to silence him, and then there was people who came to his support and say, well, the people who want to debunk him are just trying to silence him, right? There's no truth behind their criticisms of him. They're just attacking him to silence him. So Michael Bailey stands at the end of the day. He survives the attacks. But that's what happens when you repeat Blanchard's typology. You can't. It's hard to survive. Another one is Dr. Ann Lawrence, whose picture's over my head. She is transgender, male to female, self-professing autogynephilic, and she wrote the book Men Trapped in Men's Bodies, Narratives of Autogynephilic Transsexualism, written in 2012, and it's about 249 cases of transgender people over a 2-year period. that all affirmed Blanchard's typology. So here's 249 transgender people saying, "Yep, pretty accurate." Well, it's pretty good argument then. And the person who wrote it is transgender themselves. So, and she's a doctor, medical doctor. And very recently, in 2020, Dr. Deborah So, psychologist, came up with the book, The End of Gender, Debunking Myths of Sex and Identity in Our Society, who said, again, reaffirmed Blanchard's typology. And after she published this, she left academia saying you can't survive in the climate today if you're not supporting the transgender ideology, and she just thinks it's too problematic. Dr. So readily admits that she grew up in a community of gay men, right? As a straight woman, she loved being around gay men. She was surrounded with gay men. She wrote for Playboy, I think, after this. She's not a conservative by any stretch of the imagination. It's just facts are facts, right? Even liberal people who are very built into the gay community and are willing to write for Playboy have no problem being able to admit that facts are facts, but it's hard to survive in this climate with facts. So that's Blanchard's typology for chapter 6. I think it's very interesting. It comes up again in later chapters when we talk about the science, because again, once we start getting into the science of the mind, there are physical differences between the brains of autogynephilics and androphilics. So that, again, reaffirms Dr. Blanchard's theory. It might be real because we're finding real differences in the brains between these two groups of people. Okay, I hope this is helpful. I'm sorry it's so long, but we did cover the whole chapter. I'll make another video soon about chapter 7. If you want the link for the book, my book, it's in the title, in the description below. Okay, have a good one.